This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I want to jump right in with my guest today. What a fun subject. I knew nothing of this. The American rocket, the first to leave Earth's orbit, Apollo 8, December 1968. Robert Kurson, an American author, has put together this fabulous book called Rocket Men, a great narrative with all of the details, spelling out the space race, the why. What was this race to the moon? How did we get there so fast? Literally in 4 months. I mean, there was a lot of rockets before Apollo 8 over the course of the 1960s, but literally it was a 4-month project, and boom, the biggest machine man has ever built. To this day, the Saturn V rocket pushed these 3 astronauts towards the moon. Robert is a fantastic storyteller. You're really going to enjoy his perspective, and I think you'd really enjoy this book, a great piece of history. Let's jump right in with my conversation about Rocket Men. I look at this date, December 21st, 1968. I happen to have been born September 1st, 1968. So what are you? That's about 4 months in advance of this really significant date. And 1968, what a year too. I mean, I obviously don't know this because I was just born 9 months into the year. But in hindsight, going back and being a curious person and figuring out what a crazy, crazy year that was to be born. And what an interesting path for you to go down, the Apollo 8 path. Set this for me. How did you start going down this path? What was the trigger for you to get behind the scenes and detail this and this great narrative that you've put together? How did you start down this path?
Well, I was born in 1963, so some of my first memories are of watching the Apollo launches. So I have these vague memories of incredible excitement, but not just excitement at thinking of rockets and watching rockets lift off on television, but of watching adults stand in front of the television or in front of their radios, utterly and totally amazed. It was as fascinating to me to watch the adults watch Apollo as it was to watch Apollo itself at that young age. I was 5 in 1968. But the way I really got started writing about it and really thinking about it was having the good luck of living in Chicago, because we have a phenomenal museum here called the Museum of Science and Industry. And on display in the Museum of Science and Industry is a space capsule. And if you saw this thing, you would not believe that 3 people could fit in it, let alone take a ride to the moon in it. But it is the Apollo 8 space capsule. And as I looked at it a few years ago, I started to think, boy, I'm a fan of Apollo and NASA. I grew up loving it, but I don't know much, if anything, about Apollo 8. Everybody knows, as I did, about Apollo 11, which is the first moon landing. And everybody knows about Apollo 13, where there was a explosion near the moon that almost cost the crew its lives. They just made it back safely. But who knows about Apollo 8? So I went home and I started reading about Apollo 8. And the first thing that struck me, even before I read about what the mission entailed, was that many astronauts, Apollo astronauts, and many legends at NASA during the Apollo era, and even through to today, were describing Apollo 8 as the single most daring, risky, and dangerous and important mission that NASA had ever flown. And that seemed strange to me because Apollo 8 did not land on the moon, they orbited the moon. So why were all these people talking about Apollo 8 as being the riskiest, most dangerous, bold, important flight that NASA had ever run? And that's what got me interested in it. And as I started to research it, I found that Apollo 8 was all that and then some.
4 months? Is that essentially how quickly this was put together?
4 months. Normally, it required between 12 and 18 months for NASA to conduct a major space mission like this. But it was decided in August of 1968 to reschedule the order of the Apollo missions and to send Apollo 8 to the moon with a crew of 3 with just 4 months preparation. The decision, when this idea was broached to the head of NASA, James Webb, he responded by saying, "Are you out of your mind?" It was unthinkable to do something like this fast, when NASA wasn't nearly, or didn't seem nearly ready enough to pull it off. So much had to be done for the first time. So much had to go right that it seemed unthinkable even to the head of NASA itself. The risks were so incredible, and the number of firsts that had to be accomplished perfectly was so astonishing that most people hardly believed this was a serious suggestion, and yet they were dead serious about this. They were going to send the first humans in history, not just past the world altitude record of 853 miles, but 240,000 miles away to the moon, a place that humankind had longed to reach for millions of years. They were going to do it in 4 months.
Let me ask a question that I don't know if you've thought about this one in these exact terms. I'm going to go backwards in time a little bit in a moment and bring up this quest, this chase, this competition with the Soviets. As we think about a rocket taking off and going to the moon in 1968, I'm looking at my iPhone. Do you know in your head roughly the computing power that would exist on an iPhone in terms of how much greater it would be than the computing power that existed on that ship?
Yeah, I've seen various estimates. And some of the way it's phrased, I don't even understand. But one thing that's absolutely certain is there's many, many magnitudes more power in your iPhone, not just in your iPhone, but in the first iPhone that ever came out, than there was available to NASA and to the astronauts when they went to the moon. The way they did this and the calculations they relied on often came down to a slide rule. I'm not an expert in the kind of memory, the amount of memory and the kind of memory that they had aboard Apollo 8. But when it's described by experts, it seems so scary minuscule that you shake in your seat reading about it, that they would risk so much and go so far when they had very, very little more than, what we could have imagined on the very, very first desktop computers when they first started being available to the public.
It is just truly fascinating. Let's lay the foundation, though. The 1960s, well, first off, going back to World War II, coming out of World War II, and you make this case in your book, and we can only touch on just some of the highlights in this conversation, but coming out of World War II, you would have thought perhaps that Stalin would have been, we were allies with the Soviets at that time, but once we dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, Stalin was like, hey, okay, this is not good. These Americans, this is his perspective, but these people are going to try and overtake us. So he, laying flat on his back with millions upon millions dead, set in motion, and I want you to take it from here. He set in motion the space race, didn't he?
Yes, and he viewed it exactly as you said. He viewed the American nuclear capability as an existential threat, and it certainly was. But, the Soviet Union lay in ruins at the end of World War II. Entire towns and cities destroyed, millions and millions dead. The Soviets could hardly build a good car at the time. It was really an agricultural economy. But out of the ashes, the Soviets start to build this nuclear force. But, it's not enough to have a nuclear weapon. You have to have a delivery system. And so they go from the rudimentary V2 rocket that Wernher von Braun helped design for the Germans at the end of World War II. And they take it from there and they start to design and build these intercontinental ballistic missile systems.
Was that taken technology from the Germans, or were they independently developing that themselves?
I'm not entirely certain about that. I think some was taken from the Germans because some German rocket scientists went to the Soviet Union after World War II, and some, like von Braun, went to the United States. So they had very capable scientists. I'm not sure how much of the V2 technology itself transferred over, but certainly the brain power and the scientific thinking transferred over. if you have a nuclear bomb in your possession, that's one thing, but to be able to deliver it is everything. People in the United States didn't really fear the Soviet Union. Again, they could hardly build a good car, but all of a sudden in 1957, streaking overhead across the entire world is this small satellite called Sputnik. It was a wonder to people in the United States and all over the world that there could be this orbiting ball that was beeping every so often. You could tune it in, the beeps on a shortwave radio. You could even see Sputnik streaking across the sky with binoculars because the Soviets were broadcasting its location and telling you where and when it will be somewhere. So this, for about 2 or 3 days over the weekend, was a complete wonder, a joy to people in the United States. It was an amazing technological leap. But by Monday morning, maybe 2-3 days after Sputnik was launched, the reality of what it meant came crashing down on the United States. If the Soviet Union could put an orbiting body above the Earth and tell you exactly where it's going to be, then they could also put bombs up there and rain them down on any American city they chose at will, and there was nothing we could do about it, absolutely nothing. So this weekend of wonderment turned into a completely dark existential fear in the United States, and we realized, unbelievably, that this nation had jumped ahead of us technologically, at least with regards to space.
Take it a step further. So we get Sputnik up in 57. We put something up within a few months. There were some fits and starts and stops. But get me into the 1960s. Of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolds. JFK says, hey, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, I think it was. Paint for me the picture as to why the moon? Because once we have the technology to put these ships up into outer space, okay, now we have a delivery mechanism. What was the moon race about exactly? Because that's what was taking place over the decade of the 60s, right?
Exactly. You have to understand why it was the moon. Now, there are some philosophical reasons and some reasons that call to the human soul. The moon, of course, has called to mankind since our evolution. You know, it's always been there, this beautiful thing calling to us. It seems close enough almost to reach out and touch, and yet it's completely inaccessible. Forever, mankind has longed for the moon. So that's kind of the philosophical basis. But you really have to go to 1961 to understand exactly why the moon. We were behind in the space race. Sputnik launched the space race. And it seemed a matter, as I said, of existential importance to both these superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But for years, the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States. They kept achieving things first and doing these space spectaculars, and we seemed to fall farther and farther behind. When Kennedy took office, he felt he needed something so terrific, so amazing to leapfrog the Soviets in the space race, both for military reasons and propaganda reasons and all kinds of reasons.
Galvanized support from Americans.
Absolutely. But he needed something unbelievable, but he needed it to be so incredible that it would blow away the Soviets, that it would amaze the United States forever. But he needed something so difficult that it would take a long time to accomplish, because we were so far behind in 1960, 1961, that there was nothing we could do in a month or 6 months or even a year or two to catch up to them. So his advisors put together this idea that we may be able to leap ahead of the Soviets and really even defeat them if we could land a man on the moon by the end of the decade and bring him back safely. And that's exactly the promise, the insane sounding promise Kennedy made in 1961 to a stunned country. And the country wasn't just the only one stunned. NASA was stunned, because at that time in 1961, they had very little idea about how to get to the moon at all, never mind land men on there and bring them back. So that's how the moon figures in. It was so difficult and so beautiful that became the focal point from that point forward.
You know, you talk about defeating the Soviets. Are you talking about just the literal ego race to get to the moon first? Or was there, with Kennedy setting in motion, I don't know, with Kennedy setting in motion this goal, was there a military component here where this was going to help us to at least checkmate the Soviets? Or was there something where was there a military purpose here in going to the moon?
Well, they always considered that there could be colonies made on the moon, and of course, when you talk about putting men in space or putting men on other celestial objects in space, there's always the idea that you could station soldiers there. So that's one of the big ideas of the space race, that you're not just sending up a man like Yuri Gagarin to win a propaganda victory by sending the first man into space. You're also proving that men can exist in space. And if men can exist in space, then soldiers can exist in space. So all this aiming for the moon also has this component in mind of perhaps we colonize there someday, which we're still talking about, by the way, today. And if you colonize, then you can militarize. If you can reach the moon, it's not just about proving your military might or capability. It's about proving that you are the superior technological force in the world. And if you are the superior technological force, the whole quality of life for all your people wins out. And it's not just the quality of life, it's that your philosophy about what makes for a good country and a good life wins out. If the Soviets can make it to the moon first, that says a lot for communism. If we make it to the moon first, it says a lot for democracy. And that's the ultimate existential fight going on during the space race and the Cold War. Which way of life, which way of political life is the best? And so to get to the moon first, to send the first men to the moon, becomes an incredibly important, dramatic, and romantic test of which system is superior.
So let me bring you up closer. You lay a great foundation. People are going to really need to dig into your work and go read, because you really lay this out in great prose. You really make it a fun read. But as we get closer to 1968, we get closer to this launch, and I'm going to take you through some details that are really interesting to me. But something's going on in America that's tearing America apart at the seams as we are approaching this launch on December 21st, 1968. Now, it's something that for me, since I was just born for a few months, I didn't really figure it out till years later. And I happen to be calling you from Saigon, Vietnam today. So,
okay, that's relevant.
So, yeah. So why don't you map that out for me and the audience? What is going on in terms of the interplay between having this, not only are you having the space race with the Soviets, but, and of course, this gets into a longer debate that we won't go with, whether or not there was a true Vietnam satellite concern and whether or not we should have ever been there. That's a whole different issue. But the perspective was, okay, Americans are on the ground in Vietnam, quote, fighting communism. And to the average American, that was, quote, fighting the Soviets. Give me some perspective on how the space race and perhaps the Vietnam War were tying together.
1968, it could be argued, was one of the most terrible years in our country's history. And much of it was centered on Vietnam. Early in the year, you have the Tet Offensive. And here we've been told by our leaders that we're winning the war, that victory is imminent, it's around the corner. And then you have the Tet Offensive, which is a terrible disaster. And you see Walter Cronkite on TV being very honest about our prospects in Vietnam at that point, that really the most we can hope for is an honorable stalemate. And this is crushing to the American public, who've been really led to believe that we're there for honorable reasons and that we're going to win. And you see some terrible images out of Vietnam early in the year of 1968, including that iconic photograph where a guy is executing another man in the street with a pistol shot to the head, and the guy is handcuffed. And that becomes one of the most famous photographs of all time and really brings into people's homes, and there's video of it too that come into people's homes, incredible cruelty and disaster and hopelessness of this war going on in Vietnam. Upwards of 90% of the evening news coverage in 1968 is about the Vietnam War. So you can imagine that that's the overarching feeling in American households during that year. But then as the year progresses, you start to have one terrible thing after another. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., you have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, you have violence here in the streets of Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. You have violence at Columbia University. There are terrible things going on. It just seems that the country is completely divided against itself. Young versus old, Democrat versus Republican, South versus North. Nobody trusts each other. And by the way, there are a lot of echoes to 2018 going on 50 years ago. The country is very, very badly divided. And all during this time, with all the violence in the streets and the war going on and this division, the Soviets are watching this and saying, this is what democracy delivers. Look what we have to offer. So it's a terrible kind of propaganda time also for us. The Soviets are mocking us in the United Nations. And here's this race to get the first men to the moon that's being sprinted toward and is coming down to the final hours. So it becomes extremely important to a lot of people who gets to the moon first.
Let me get specific on the ship, the rocket, some of the things that were taking place in that 4 months that lead up to December 21st. After Thanksgiving, give me the insight for the people that were there, the people on the inside. We're getting ready to launch that rocket in about a month. What did people on the inside think the chances were that those 3 guys taking off in that rocket would last even a minute? Because I'm going to ask you in a second about the details of how powerful that rocket was. What were the chances of success for this in their minds?
It all comes down to who you ask. If you ask them what were the chances of a totally successful mission, I think you're looking at less than 50-50. You have to remember, and if you ask one of the astronauts himself, Bill Anders, and you got to remember, these guys are world's greatest test pilots and fighter pilots. They have supreme confidence in everything they do and everything they touch. You ask Bill Anders, what were the chances of a successful Apollo 8 mission, put together with only 4 months preparation? And he would have told you, as he told his wife, he thinks there's a 1/3 chance of a successful mission, a 1/3 chance of an unsuccessful mission but they do make it home alive, and a 1/3 chance that they don't survive the mission at all. So this is viewed as extremely dangerous on the inside. Now, if you go to people who are analyzing it, people were begging NASA not to do this, including some experts saying this is way too fast. Think about this for a second. They're going to take the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built, to this day, by the way. They're going to take that not a few hundred miles above Earth. They're going to take it 250,000 miles to the moon. You would think that they have to be absolutely certain in the Saturn V's technology, but in fact, by the time Apollo 8 was ready to go, the Saturn V rocket had only been tested twice, both times without men aboard, and the second test had ended in near catastrophe. Almost everything failed on that second test, and yet NASA decided that the next time the Saturn V would fly would be with Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders aboard, and they were going to go to the moon. That's the kind of risk that was going on. It was almost unthinkable. And even beyond that, they were going to go without a lunar lander, because remember, they're going to prove that men can go to the moon and back. They're going to become the first men to the moon, but they're not going to land. So they're not going to take the troubled lunar lander that was still not ready to go. But that meant that they did not have a backup engine aboard their spacecraft. So if anything went wrong during this flight, they could not rely on a backup engine. They were almost certain to be stranded at the moon forever, or crash into the moon, or fly off into solar orbit. So their one engine that they took on the way to the moon had to work perfectly, repeatedly, or they were goners. It was unthinkable risk, incredibly dramatic.
Let me let you dig into the Saturn V rocket more. I find this fascinating. Going into your work and then pulling up other pieces of insight on the internet myself. The Saturn V rocket, you just mentioned the most powerful machine ever built to this day. Give me more there. Map that out. I mean, when this thing takes off, put some numbers to it, put the feeling. I mean, I was reading there was, if you were on the ground when this thing took off, there was waves that were hitting you, and the thrust. I mean, was it literally causing earthquakes?
Yeah, you could feel it from miles away. It was something unlike anyone had ever experienced. I urge people to go onto YouTube and listen to Walter Cronkite's description of the first Saturn V launch, where he is absolutely beside himself. The glass and the walls are shaking around him. He has to hold the supports up around him to prevent collapse, and he's miles away. It's unlike anything anyone had ever experienced before. There are various ways to try to understand the power that this rocket was generating. It provided the energy the peak energy usage of the entire United Kingdom just in its launch off the ground. Even people miles and miles away felt the earth shake. You could not understand the power. Nobody could, including the astronauts who were inside, who had been simulated launch during these 4 months of training, but nothing. There was no equipment that could possibly prepare them for the violence that was inside the command module that they were riding atop the Saturn V.
The takeoff, to read your descriptions on the takeoff, it was such a violent shaking that they really didn't have the ability, while they were taking off, to read the instruments.
No, they couldn't read the instruments. They couldn't control their bodies. And remember, they'd had the best engineers in the world preparing them for 4 months for this thing, and nothing was what they expected. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell had flown in space before on the Gemini program, but that rocket was a baby compared to this. This was slow, lumbering, and extremely violent. All three men would realize minutes after the launch that their helmets had been gouged from the violence of the launch. Bill Anders believed that the rocket's fins were being torn off by the launch tower. That's how crazy violent it was inside the thing. This was an incredibly powerful machine, the only machine powerful enough to lift the kind of heavy load that they were going to send to the moon. So they had no choice but to use this unbelievable piece of engineering. But nobody had ever experienced violence and power like that in human history.
Talk about, too, when they're taking off, I think this simplifies it a little bit, but there's an abort handle where one of the three astronauts can make the decision to abort. Now, the way you're describing this Saturn V rocket, I mean, once that thrust starts and you call abort, I mean, even if you call abort, it still might not end nicely. But speak to this, the abort handle and some of the thought process that was going on, because they were really thinking about not going forward, that this was such a concern, that this was going so far off, we might need to abort.
Right. Remember that in only the second and most recent test flight of the Saturn V, so much had gone wrong. So Borman, the commander, has his hand on a abort handle that he can use in his judgment if he needs to end the flight. Now remember, once that Saturn V is a half an inch off the ground, it's way too late for the thing to settle back down if engines start to fail. So it's all on Borman, and he has to make these decisions in a split second about what to do. And as you said, it's extremely dangerous to abort. It's a violent experience, and astronauts may not even survive an abort. But if it's necessary, it's necessary, because if they don't do it and you require abort, they're going to die for sure. So Borman has to have his hand on this handle and be ready. But the thing that was incredible to me is Anders had looked over at Borman and had seen Borman move his hand away from the abort handle. These guys were not going to abort if it was absolutely possible to keep riding this thing.
It looks like the risks with aborting, as I go through your work, the risk with aborting, you might as well have just gone through with it. There were no good numbers here, so why even try to abort? You might as well just give it a shot. It was kind of the impression I got from your work.
That's pretty much true, but if the rocket starts to lift off and it gets a few feet off the ground and then starts to fall back to the launch pad, then they're dead. So you have really no choice in a situation like that to abort, or otherwise you're going to burn up. And remember that just a year and a half before this, or maybe closer to 2 years, 3 astronauts died on the launch pad on Apollo 1 during a training exercise, and they burned up inside the command module. So that is very fresh in the minds of every astronaut, and also in the minds of everyone in the American public. This was a terrible disaster and tragedy. These guys are very much aware of what can happen if you're stuck inside a capsule.
They couldn't hear anything, could they?
No, they couldn't hear anything. They couldn't see anything. Their heads are shaking so badly, and they have no control over their bodies either. Their arms turn to lead during the tremendous G-forces required to get this behemoth off the ground.
When you say turn to lead, put some numbers to that so people can appreciate what you mean.
Well, at some point early in the launch, let's say they were at 4 Gs, meaning they are experiencing 4 times the weight of gravity as the rocket muscles itself up into space, so that their arms weigh 4 times more than they weigh on Earth, and they're shaking around violently. Their heads are going crazy. And they're supposed to be reading their instruments because the instruments are part of what tells them if things are going right or wrong. They're also supposed to be listening to mission control, but they're having a very difficult time hearing anything there. So they really have to rely on just guts and instinct. And that's a very tough call. And my judgment from just talking to these guys for so long and getting to know them so well was that they were going to trust in NASA's engineers and the scientists who built this beautiful, violent, terrible, spectacular rocket, and they were going to ride it out unless something was very obviously wrong. And Borman's hand was not going to turn that handle, and they were going to ride this thing to the moon.
So once they get out. I guess the best way to say this would they get out of the Earth's orbit, or is it just a change of orbit? So instead of it's circular, it changes to more. Explain that.
Well, the first goal that they have is to get into Earth orbit, a stable Earth orbit, because that will allow them to check all systems. Now, that's very smooth. It's the opposite of the launch, of course. It's extremely smooth. There's a feeling of weightlessness going on, and it gives them a chance to confirm that everything's okay in the command module, and it gives NASA a chance to confirm that everything's okay on the ground with their telemetry, with everything that's looks good. So they have a chance to confirm that everything's fine. So they're in Earth orbit, and it's unbelievable to listen to Bill Anders. This is his first space flight. He's the youngster of the group. He's 35 years old, and he's describing what it's like to see the Earth go by beneath him. Borman and Lovell had seen this already, but Anders was just amazed. But they all had to work, and they all had to make sure everything was good. And the idea was, once they confirmed that everything looked good, and once NASA did on the ground confirm the same, then they were going to relight the third stage engine that had helped boost them into Earth orbit and set course for the moon. And that required Apollo 8 to reach speeds that exceeded any that man had ever traveled, to escape Earth's gravity and set course for the moon.
What does that do to the human body? I mean, they must have obviously they figured out these calculations to the best of their ability, but when they hit to that speed to escape the orbit and head to the moon, is there a whole new something happening to the human body that we as a species, a race, we have no data on, or did they have a rough idea of what was going to happen to the astronauts physically?
Yeah, I think they had a rough idea, and it surprised me as a layperson to discover when they achieved those escape velocities to leave Earth orbit. It just felt like a gentle push to them. It was nothing like the experience of launch or getting into Earth orbit, which required this tremendous acceleration. They had to pick up speed, but it felt like a gentle push, and they felt themselves pushed back in their couches. They call them couches. They're really seats, but they're kind of leaning back and strapped in. But it's an extra little boost, and it's smooth. And if it works right, and the engine works right, you leave Earth. And when that happened, these were the first human beings ever to leave Earth and Earth's gravitational influence. And that was a huge moment for the people at NASA and for people on Earth paying attention, that for the first time, human beings had left their own planet.
So, you mentioned the capsule in the beginning at the Chicago Museum. I pulled it up to look at that battered baby. It is so tiny. I'm curious if you know, maybe if you met the guys, what was in terms of the size of the three astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, William Anders, what was the size? Were they 6 foot, 160 pounds? Were they 5'8", 145 pounds? What were the size of these men?
Well, I think Frank Borman and Bill Anders are probably about 5'9", somewhere around there, but I can't say for sure. Lovell is a little bit taller. He may even be closing in on 6 feet. So when we look at that capsule, it seems like, how could you be in there for an hour with two other people? It's so small. But you have to remember that these guys are coming from a background of test pilots and fighter pilots, so they're very much used to tight quarters and isolation for long durations. But there's another thing to remember, and that is for Borman and Lovell, they had flown together aboard Gemini 7. And the Gemini capsule, now that was for 2 men, not 3, but it was so tiny. It was you could compare the size to being the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle. It was almost no room to move at all. And Borman and Lovell spent 2 weeks in that tiny, tiny capsule.
You mean just one seat in the Beetle?
The front half of it. For them to have endured 2 weeks in those tiny quarters, the Apollo command module seemed like a palatial mansion. Now, you and I would go to it, and you saw it online. It looks very tiny, but every pound counts on space missions, even today, of course. So they had to make it small and make it do its job without taking up any more real room than was necessary. So that's what these guys were looking at.
When I was a kid, I used to always think about these things when the Air and Space Museum, the first one, opened in Washington, D.C. You would always think to yourself as like a 12-year-old kid going there for the first time, like, how do people use the toilet, right? This would be your thought. You're like, okay, how does that work? And it was never really properly explained as a youth. Now, on this particular mission, we had a situation where one guy basically needed vomiting and diarrhea.
Yeah, and it was a very, very dangerous situation. I was also, by the way, fascinated with how would these guys go to the bathroom? And I thought, oh, that's an embarrassing thing to think. That's childish to think of. But then when I mentioned it to other people, everyone wanted to know the same thing. So I got into that in great detail with the guys, and they explained it to me. And I was stunned to find some stuff out. For example, the Apollo astronauts vented urine out of the spacecraft. Just the venting of urine could change the trajectory of the spacecraft in space, and you had to compensate for it with light adjustments. Also, for defecating, you had to, I won't go into the graphic detail, you can see it in the book, the feces had to be mixed with germicide to prevent the entire thing from exploding. There was some drama involved in waste aboard the spacecraft, but you're right. Ultimately, Frank Borman, the commander of this flight, Apollo 8, got extremely sick. He was vomiting, which was very unpleasant for his two crewmates. But fascinating for them as well. Anders describes in beautiful lyrical detail about how the pieces of vomit would spiral and float and break into two, and how he observed Newton's laws being preserved as he watched Borman's vomit. And then Borman ultimately had diarrhea that was even more unpleasant. But worse than all the unpleasantries of the sickness was the idea that nobody knew why Borman was sick. And if he was sick for reasons that could affect the other crew members, it was quite likely that they had to be called back. So NASA convened emergency meetings to try to figure out what was wrong with Borman. Was it contagious or not? And could the flight continue?
How do they figure that out from the ground?
Well, it's very difficult to figure out of the ground, and it was made even more difficult by the fact that Borman would not allow his crewmates to report his sickness at first. And they were saying, look, we got to report this. We don't know what's happening. Maybe they can help you. But Borman was the commander. He was the boss. He did not want Mission Control to know it, not because he was embarrassed, but because he, and truthfully, many of the other astronauts had had a lot of experience with NASA doctors who, in their opinion, in the astronauts' opinion, tried to insinuate themselves much too much into the affairs of spaceflight. And Borman feared that if the doctors found out about this, they would be too cautious. They would try to become too much a part of the mission, and it was too risky to allow them to contemplate calling the flight back. So for a long time, Borman didn't allow a reporting. But then Anders came up with a really interesting kind of middle ground secret solution that I describe in the book, whereby Mission Control could be alerted to this, but without alerting all the media and the public, who would then become extremely worried and concerned about the flight, whether it was called back or continued.
I want to make sure the audience understands something with our conversation. We're just going broad, and I'm just being a curious guy to ask you questions. But the granular detail that you go into in your work in Rocket Men, I mean, that's the really fascinating stuff. So, not as a pitch to people that they need to necessarily go buy, but this is one of these kind of historical accounts where you read it and your jaw drops. You're just like, wow, we did that. I mean, not we personally, but we human beings figured this out and did it. And for you to go back and to categorize and put the details together and make it into a great narrative flow. I mean, hey, that's worth the cost of admission. We all waste more money on these freaking drinks at Starbucks with whipped cream and caramel all day long than a great books. Let's take it to something that was really interesting that came out of this too, the telecast. Live, it was live on TV, right?
Yes. Well, they actually had planned for 4 live telecasts, but one of them stood out to the astronauts long before they even launched. And that was the one they were going to make on Christmas Eve as they orbited the moon. Now remember, at this point, nobody even knows if they're going to make it to the moon. And if they do make it to the moon, are they going to crash into the moon? Will their single engine continue to work flawlessly? But the astronauts are charged with saying something appropriate to the world when they are orbiting and making this live broadcast. They are told only one thing, and that is that more people will be listening to their voices than have ever listened to human voices in history. It was estimated that up to a third of the world's population would be tuning in to hear what they said at the moon, live, the first human beings ever to leave Earth and ever to arrive at a new world, to arrive at the moon. Their only guidance was say something appropriate. Can you imagine in this day and age that there's no meetings, no committees, no focus groups?
Say something appropriate.
Say something appropriate. Nobody gave them guidance. Nobody cleared it. Nobody asked them, come to us when you decide and we'll clear it up through, 250 channels here. Just say something appropriate. And they left it at that. That is unthinkable today, especially speaking to more people than have ever heard a human voice at the same time in history. And yet these astronauts are charged with coming up with something appropriate. And it's left to them, and it's left to them during these frantic 4 months, which they have to cram all this training in to learn how to go to the moon for the first time. It's on them. What they come up with the help of some others, is just astonishing and made for one of the most beautiful and poetic and just beautifully on point moments, I think, in our history. What they decided to say at the moon during their Christmas Eve broadcast really, I think, lives to this day as one of the most poignant and beautiful and perfect moments in our history. At first, Borman, Lovell, and Anders got together and thought, what should we do here? What should we be saying on this incredible moment when a third of the world's population will be tuning in? And they started to think, well, maybe we should write some new lyrics to Jingle Bells, or say do something humorous. But it seemed much too important a moment. This is man's first, arrival at the moon. They wanted to say something meaningful. And they started to think of some religious things to say, but they didn't want to exclude anybody. If they said something that was purely Christian, then other people would feel excluded. And they thought this journey was for all mankind. It wasn't for one group or one country. It was for everyone across the globe. But they just couldn't come up with the right thing. And so Borman turned to a man who was very thoughtful and whom he respected. And even that guy couldn't come up with anything. So that guy turned it over to his friend, who also couldn't come up with anything. And now time is getting really short. The launch is coming. And the second guy's wife, at about 3 a.m, has an epiphany. And she whispers it to her husband. And he realizes right away that is exactly the right thing to say when man first arrives at the moon. And he passes it on to Borman. Borman recognizes it as perfect. He shows it to his 2 crewmates. They agree. They write it down on fireproof paper, put it in the flight plan, and pack it aboard Apollo 8. A couple weeks later, Christmas Eve, here comes the broadcast live to the world. Almost a third of the world's population is tuned in. It's an incredible moment, and the world is watching the moon pass beneath them live. And then they have just a minute or 2 left, and they say they'd like to deliver a message to the world. And they start to read the first lines from the book of Genesis. It stuns people. It stuns the people at NASA. It stuns the astronauts' wives and family who knew nothing about this. The astronauts did not breathe a word of this to anybody. The entire world is fixated in the beginning, and they speaking to a huge segment of the world's population. So many religions recognize Genesis, and it's so apropos for the moment about how the world has come into being, and they have transfixed the world. And at the end of this terrible year of strife and war and assassinations and violence, where everybody is torn apart, the world is listening to these words from these 3 men who are at the moon and talking back to them and speaking to them. and everybody seems to agree this is beautiful. We are one at this moment.
I'm going to put a pin in it right there because I'm going to make people go read the rest of everything and read all the details that set everything in motion. You're obviously a great storyteller. I'd love to pick your mind as to how you developed that craft, because obviously you did not, I don't think you woke up one day and decided you're going to go down this path. Exactly. I don't know how it unfolded. I would remind the audience too, and I've not read this, but in preparing to talk to you, I was not aware of the book. I guess I had probably heard some details, but one of your bestseller called Shadow Divers, fascinating backstory, finding a German U-boat 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey in 1991. So, Mr. and Mrs. America, the Nazis were a lot closer than we ever thought, and that would be another one of Robert's books you should check out, right?
Absolutely. And one of the incredible things about the Shadow Divers story is that, there are only, I believe, 5 German U-boats left in existence. 4 of them are in Europe, but the one that's in the United States is at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, not just a few steps from the Apollo 8 space capsule. So this museum figures deeply into my life. And when you grow up in Chicago, you go to the Museum of Science and Industry every year as a kid on a field trip. These things have lived inside me for a long time, long before I ever thought of becoming a writer or telling stories at all.
Oh, it's the Field Museum that has Sue, the T-Rex.
Right,
Yes.
That's right.
Okay. I've actually had a conversation on this show with the guy that found Sue. Fascinating story there.
Yeah, Sue's incredible. That's worth a trip to Chicago alone, yeah.
The book, Rocket Men, The Daring Odyssey of Apollo 8 and the Astronauts Who Made Man's First Journey to the Moon. Robert, very cool stuff. I kind of don't want to pick your mind too much because I want people to go check it out because it's, and this because it's sometimes, and I had a good fortune to put together a historical narrative on a subject in the trading world once. And you kind of feel lucky in some ways that when you come into something, because, you didn't live this, but you've got the chance to be the keeper of the flame and to put it in motion and put all the details together, and everyone trusted you to do it. That's a piece of history. The fact that you got a chance to put that together. So I commend you, and I definitely, again, implore the audience to go check it out.
I can't thank you enough. I felt very lucky and honored that the astronauts trusted me and spent so much time with me and gave me the firsthand account of this incredibly historic flight. This is a great American story, and it's a great human story, and it's one of the greatest untold stories, I think, in our history. It's, again, the first time we ever left our home and the first time we ever arrived at a new world. The risks were immense. It's just lucky that we still have these guys around to tell us firsthand what happened.
Is there any place we can send people to, Robert? Is there a website you'd like people to go to? The book, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Is there a website for you?
It's my name, Robert Kurson, Kurson, robertkurson.com. And that has all kinds of stuff. And I'll put all kinds of extras up about the book, some film. I was lucky enough to fly with 2 of the astronauts. So I have some film of that and all kinds of extra materials and videos. It's a wonderful chance to see what these guys did because everything was filmed and shot and there's thousands of pictures. So it's a real good opportunity.
What's nice too is you can take the book like I did and then you can go to YouTube and start digging on pieces of footage and whatnot. So it's really fun.
Yeah, you could go right now on YouTube and watch the entire launch of Apollo 8 and it's spectacular. It happened at just the right time in history where we had color film and beautiful announcing and full-time coverage. You could read a transcript of the entire flight, all 6.5 days of it. So there's a lot to work with if you're interested.
Robert, I appreciate you taking the time today.
I am so honored. I loved being here, and thank you for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.